So we all know about Jaune's weapon, right? And how it's fundamentally different than most other weapons that we've seen in the RWBY universe so far. Unlike other weapons, Jaune's sword can't transform to allow for different fighting styles, it can't shoot long-range attacks, nor can it use any dust crystals, as far as we can tell at least. And most notably, it is a weapon that he did not forge himself. All the other characters that we have seen at Beacon Academy had forged their weapons before they had come to Beacon Academy, and have named them themselves and have had a lot of practice with them. Jaune, on the other hand, inherited his sword from his great-grandfather who fought in the Great War. He did not forge it himself, he did not name it himself, and he obviously hasn't had too much training with it before he got to Beacon Academy, hence why Pyrrha was training him. All of these aspects set Jaune's sword apart from other weapons that we know in the RWBY universe, except maybe Ozpin's cane. But one thing we do know about Jaune's sword is at least part of its legacy, that it was used in the Great War. And we're left with the question, what sword-wielding hero do we know of who fought in the Great War? The answer, of course, that comes to mind is the King of Vale, who single-handedly decimated numerous men in the war and led his troops to Vacuo to essentially end the war, and had all the kings bow to him at the end and was revered and was going to be worshipped as the king of Remnant overall, but ended up refusing that role. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that the King of Vale is what I believe Ozpin's previous reincarnation, considering he had a hand in building the Huntsman Academies, and since he fought with sword and scepter, I believe that the scepter that he currently has, that Ozpin currently has, is the scepter that the King of Vale was using as well. Now, one aspect I would like to believe is that the sword that the King of Vale was wielding is the sword that Jaune currently has now. Now, I don't think that the King of Vale is Jaune's grandfather, because I feel that that would have been significant overall in, Jaune's history, that his father would have told him, you're born from royalty, and things like that. But one thing I think could have happened is that the King of Vale entrusted the sword to one of his confidants at the time, and that ended up being Jaune's grandfather, and the sword was passed down to eventually Jaune at this point. Now, there's also flaws within that, because Ozpin would have recognized the sword, likely at least, when Jaune was wielding it and when he first came to the school. But Ozpin made no mention of that, not even, oh, your sword looks interesting, or something along those lines. Like even he did with Ruby in her silver eyes. First thing he says to her is comments on her silver eyes. Nothing of the sort happened with Jaune, other than maybe he doesn't exactly fit in there. But you never know, he could have recognized something and not said anything about it. I believe he did take some interest in him when Glinda said, that Jaune boy, I don't really think he belongs here. Ozpin just looked at him and just didn't really say anything. So there could have been something there. And one thing that you may not have known about Jaune's sword is its actual name. The name of Jaune's sword is Corsia Mors, which is Latin for Yellow Death. Now, back in the time of the Great War, when Jaune's sword was likely created, or even before that, I'm guessing weapons were named more conventionally for feats that they attained, or that the wielders attained while wielding those weapons. And I don't know if every weapon was named at that time, etc., etc. So let's assume that the sword earned its name through battle. The King of Vale, decimating numerous men, if he was wielding this sword, giving it the name Yellow Death, especially considering that the battle was fought in Vacuo, in a sea of sand, which is mostly desert, could be having a yellow tinge to it if the sun hits it correctly. Having it named the Yellow Death would make so much sense. And as I mentioned, if it was given to someone else to pass down their family line, it would make a lot of sense. That's just one possibility. Another thing that is also worth mentioning is that in Beacon Academy, the statue that is seen in a couple scenes at the end of Volume 2, when Raven is standing in front of it when Yang is approaching her, and also in the opening of Volume 1, the statue that depicts a huntsman and huntress standing over a Beowulf. The sword that the huntsman is carrying very closely depicts the sword that Jaune has. Now, if Ozpin was involved with the design of this statue, it would make sense that he would depict the sword in an image that he would remember. And if that depicts Jaune's sword, because also in the opening of Volume 1, we see Jaune looking up at that statue specifically. So that could be something he envisions his grandfather as. Maybe he knows something about the statue. We don't exactly know. Nothing's really been explained about that. But it's definitely something interesting to note. Now, another possibility, or a more likely possibility as well, is that the sword that Jaune has does have significance, that it was used in the Great War, but that it wasn't actually the one wielded by the King of Vale. But I do believe that Jaune, either if he doesn't have the sword currently, he will inherit the sword that the King of Vale had. Because for one person to have all of that power and be able to decimate so many people in just on his own in a war setting like that, his sword would have to have some unique power, which Jaune's sword doesn't seem to have. Now, there are theories out there that the sword wielded by the King of Vale is actually a relic, more specifically the Relic of Destruction, which would make sense given the power that the King of Vale displayed during the war. And now that relic would rest in Vacuo's vault. And this also fits with the theory that the symbols of each kingdom represents the form that the relics take that rest within each of the respective kingdoms. For example, Haven had a lantern as its relic, and its symbol quite resembles a lantern as well. So Vacuo, having 3 swords as its symbol, would have a relic resting there, the Relic of Destruction, in the form of a sword, which would make it arguably easier to wield than a lot of the other relics, and would also make sense for Jaune to be the one to get, considering he's the only one in the series so far that wields just a straight-up sword and nothing else. Like, yes, Crow wields a sword as well, but he's most notably known for using a scythe. So I believe it would make sense for Jaune to get that relic. And it would also make sense giving him a substantial power increase, and would also give him a significant fighting force against Salem herself. So either through the sword that Jaune currently wields, and the sword that Jaune will eventually wield, being the Relic of Destruction, housed in Vacuo, whether he gets it when they arrive at Vacuo, or if Salem's faction gets it first and he eventually reclaims it from them, I believe that Jaune will be inheriting the King of Vale's will. The King of Vale fought to reunite all of the 4 kingdoms and gave them all their individuality as kingdoms in and of themselves, allowed them to self-govern and form their own economy and own history in and of themselves. Jaune, who is currently fighting against Salem, fighting for the freedom of the kingdoms, will eventually be fighting to reunite them all under one banner and probably bring peace to all of them, because it seems likely, with the tensions running high between Atlas closing its borders, as well as the Faunus and humans, who will still have tension between them, even though the Faunus did come to help Haven, there will be another great war, and that'll be the end game of the RWBY series overall. And Jaune will be at the center of it, fighting, resembling what the King of Vale did in the First Great War years ago. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, whether Jaune's sword will have much more significance in the story overall, other than what it already has, where it has been upgraded with Pyrrha's metal, her weapons, that it symbolizes already the faith that Pyrrha put in him. Is it the sword that the King of Vale wielded, or do you believe, as I do, that Jaune will eventually inherit the sword that the King of Vale wielded? Let me know down below, and thank you guys for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you like this theory, and I'll see you in the next video.